Good evening, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Peter Kennedy. Paul Foster Bell, who very kindly facilitated the our using this room for this round table, is going to be a little bit late, so I've been asked to welcome you all, and therefore that's what I'm doing. It's a welcome, of course, on behalf of the EU delegation, the EU Centres Network, and of course my own institute, the Institute of International Affairs. The topic of this evening's discussion is the European Union and the United Kingdom. What next after the UK election? What next indeed? Despite the efforts of one or two of us over many years, the EU tends to be looked at from a New Zealand perspective through British eyes. This is particularly skewed if one relies solely on the British media for analysis. Yet the result of last week's British election, or more particularly the commitment now to be realised of having an in-out vote on EU membership, fully justifies the current focus and this timely panel discussion. There are ramifications for both the EU and the UK over what happens between now and the referendum, for EU business in the UK and UK business in the EU, for social security payments. Think of the situation, the different situation between Australia and ourselves, and multiply it by a number. And also potentially for the movement of people, at least to and from Britain. These are matters where the ramifications, especially on business and the movement of people, could be directly relevant to Kiwis also. Ironically, what might have been a different result in Britain had proportional representation been in force, could have made the challenge that David Cameron faces even more difficult, especially if UKIP had taken their share of the vote in 2 seats. But I will leave that to our panel. We have 3 excellent panellists in British High Commissioner Johnathan Sinclair, EU Delegation Head Michalis Rokas, and an expert on referenda and comparative electoral systems, Professor Jack Vowles. At least 2 of the panel are alleged to have worked for British Foreign Secretaries in their time, although at least one of them denies it now. But to orchestrate the discussion, the panel is chaired by Professor Martin Holland.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. I will not intervene. We're here to hear our 3 speakers on this very interesting and timely topic.
Thank you, Peter and Martin, for your introductions. Thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. It's been quite an extraordinary few days and an extraordinary election result, and the analysis and discussion of that result goes on. But one thing is very clear. On Friday, the 8th of May, Prime Minister David Cameron stood in Downing Street and amongst his other comments said, "We will deliver an in-out referendum on the future of Europe." And this followed a very clear manifesto commitment. It will be a fundamental principle of a future Conservative government that membership of the European Union depends on the consent of the British people. And in recent years, that consent has worn wafer thin. That's why after the election, we will negotiate a new settlement for Britain in Europe, and then ask the British people whether they want to stay in the EU on this reformed basis or leave. David Cameron has committed that he will lead a government that offers an in-out referendum. We will hold that in-out referendum before the end of 2017 and respect the outcome. Several commentators around the world, and especially in the UK and Europe, are asking what this means. Now, clearly much will depend on events over the coming months and years, and I certainly don't have the answers to all of the questions. But what I'll do tonight is set out three things. First, the Prime Minister's thinking of the challenges facing Europe. Secondly, his vision for how to address those challenges, as well as early indications of issues that will form part of the negotiations. And then I will look at next steps and briefly comment on early signs about the prospects for the next 2 years. Let me say here that I thoroughly recommend a speech that the Prime Minister gave in early 2013, January 2013. That was his most important speech during his first term, and I draw heavily on it here. Challenges. In that speech, the Prime Minister set out three major challenges facing Europe. First, problems in the Eurozone driving fundamental change in Europe. As everyone here knows, Britain is not in the single currency, and we're not going to be. But we all need the Eurozone to have the right governance and structures to secure a successful currency for the longer term. And those of us outside the Eurozone also need certain safeguards to ensure, for example, that our access to the single market is not in any way compromised. The second challenge is that while there are some countries within the EU which are doing pretty well economically, taken as a whole, Europe's share of world output is projected to fall by almost a third in the next 2 decades. This is the competitiveness challenge. Complex rules restricting labour markets are not some naturally occurring phenomenon and need tackling. As Chancellor Merkel said, if Europe today accounts for just over 7% of the world's population and produces around 25% of global GDP and has to finance 50% of global social spending, then it's obvious it will have to work very hard to maintain its prosperity and way of life. The third challenge is the democratic deficit. There has been a growing frustration that the EU is sometimes seen as something that is done to people rather than acting on their behalf. People, especially in the UK, are frustrated that decisions have been taken further and further away, that mean living standards are slashed through enforced austerity or taxes are used to bail out governance on the other side of the continent. Now, this democratic deficit is very important for the UK government. Over the last 2 decades, France, Netherlands, Denmark, Spain have all held referendums on different EU treaties. The UK hasn't held one since 1975. Since that vote, there have been 5 treaties changing the UK's relationship with the European Union. And the nature of that relationship is very different from 1975. So a very important part of the reason the government wants to have the referendum is to re-secure popular consent for our membership.